Hello, everybody. On today's episode, I have on a guest who has been studying the list of goddesses of the Bible, God's wife, and cannabis in the Bible. He is author of the book, A History of the Goddess From the Ice Age to the Bible. Everybody, welcome Ed Dodge to the show. Welcome to the show, Ed.
Yeah, thanks for that kind applause there. I didn't realize it was an audience.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's the universe is always listening.
All right. That's good.
So, how are you doing today?
We're doing great. We're having a good day here. And how about yourself?
Well, I've had a rough one. I got up at 3:30 this morning, and I was a few minutes late for us, or maybe I was right on time, but I like to be 10 minutes early. But I just got back from work, and before I even got home, I had to pick up my daughter from basketball, so it was a little hectic in here. So I'm nice and settled in now, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, busy day. I know how it goes with the little kids and running around.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Oh, and actually, this is the first day I got my new chair yesterday. I got that put together, and I got to tell you, it's so much more comfortable than my last one. So I
I
bet
know
this will
that.
be
I
a,
know
a
that
great
feeling too. I
conversation.
got a new chair recently myself, and that makes
Oh,
a big
wow.
difference.
Yes, sir. All right, so why don't you tell my audience a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, thanks. My name is Edward Dodge. I live in well, I'm a native of Washington, D.C. I live here now. I had I got into this book sort of by accident. I work in tech, and so all this stuff was just as a hobby. But I'd been studying the history of cannabis for like basically since I was a college student. I find it very interesting because both the fiber and the plant drugs both go back to the Neolithic Revolution, to the very dawn of to the dawn of history, or at least to the dawn of agriculture and the dawn of civilization. And it's been used consistently ever since, and in an unbroken thread of history. We could trace its usage and pretty consistent cultural usages. So it ends up being sort of a very consistent thread all the way through history. And so I'd been studying that, and I was looking at and I was working in the cannabis industry in California for a couple of years, which did not go well as like a job choice. But anyway, I was out in California,
So was
and
this
I
before it was legalized?
this is like during 2018. I was out
Oh,
there.
okay.
I was out there for 2018, 2019, working in the legal industry.
Oh, okay.
Um, no, there was a lot more money being made in the gray market up until legalization. Legalization
Hmm.
itself kind of wrecked a lot of stuff.
I
So,
bet.
I was doing this research on cannabis in the Bible. If you're not familiar with it, there's basically this is modern scholarship. Chris Bennett is the guy who's really the leading guy on all this. There's 5 references in the original Hebrew that were mistranslated as a different plant, so you don't read it in the English text. And the most important one is with Moses in Exodus, and it's an ingredient in Moses' holy anointing oil. Holy anointing oil is very important because it anoints all the important items in the temple. It anoints the kings, anoints the priests. Jesus Christ is the anointed one. I mean, the holy anointing oil is it's a very central and important recipe all the way through history. So the original Hebrew has cannabis in it. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Um, so then I wanted to know, I figured, so cannabis was sacred at the time of Moses, and it's not sacred now. At some point or another in history, it got thrown out. It got its status in the Jewish traditions switched. It changed over. It went from being sacred to not being sacred at some point in history. So I was just curious about that, trying to figure out where that happened, where it happened in the Bible, or where it happens in history. Um, and then separately, I learned about the goddesses. I learned about the modern scholars all saying that the early Hebrews were polytheistic before they were monotheistic. Basically, they were pagans before they were, what we know of today, and that God had a wife, and her name is Asherah. And I thought, that's crazy because I grew up in church. I grew up not as like a real hardcore believer, but I went to church regularly all the way through K through 12. And I'd never heard of Asherah even once. And I'd certainly never heard of even the concept of a wife of God. That just seemed like the most outrageous thing I'd ever heard. So I was curious to learn more about Asherah and who she really was, because she is there over 40 times in the Bible. So,
Wow,
um,
that's mind blowing to me. I've never heard any of this. Never.
right. Yeah. Asherah.
Outside of the cannabis stuff, I heard. We'll get into that a little bit. But this Asherah stuff, this is. I can't believe that I've never heard any of this before.
Yeah, that was pretty much my response too. And then I looked up in my Bible. I had the same Bible I had from my church as a kid, or you can look it up online. Really, part of the story is the internet, and the internet making all of this scholarship accessible, and the fact that you can nowadays with Bible tools like BibleHub.com is a site I use the most. You can read everything in Hebrew and study it all in Hebrew and have it all translated for you. I don't read Hebrew, but like it's all the same thing for any of the ancient languages: Assyrian, Greek, Sumerian, cuneiform. I mean, it's all translated for you on the internet. So it makes all these stories accessible where they were not accessible before. So I started researching Asherah. Most of the time, most of those 40 references, it says an Asherah pole, which they describe as a carved wooden pole, which is, and they're pretty ambiguous about it because really people didn't know much. Um, but I likened it to a Native American totem pole. And in fact, that is what it is. It's the totem poles are found all over Eurasia. They're found in Siberia. They're not just with Native Americans. They came over when the Native Americans came over from Eurasia originally, but the totem pole is just a really ancient thing. It's always been around. Europeans have a maypole that they use for May Day celebrations. It's all part of the same Mother Earth traditions, and so that's what the Asherah pole is. And in the Bible, it's treated as this, as a pagan idol, and so they cut it down. They cut it down. The Yahwist reformers cut it down and burn it repeatedly on multiple instances. But other times when they're talking about how bad the pagan kings are and all the horrible things the Canaanites are doing, one of the things that they're doing is having Asherah poles. And so it's just mentioned repeatedly in the context of the pagan Canaanites.
So the pagans were worshiping God's wife, and the Jews didn't like this, so they cut down and burned all these totem poles to Asherah.
Yep, pretty much. So basically, the long story is that the Israelites, all scholars nowadays agree that the Israelites basically were Canaanites. And so the early pagan Israelites are worshiping all the same gods that in the Bible they describe as foreign gods. So Baal was the king of the gods. That's Yahweh's chief rival. Asherah is the mother goddess. Astarte is the goddess of love and war. And she was actually the most popular one. She's the queen of heaven, and she's the same as Ishtar of Babylon and Inanna from Sumer and Aphrodite Urania. And she's got a lot of names. She was really the most popular deity in the entire ancient Near East. She is chief rival too. When God talks about being jealous, you shall know the gods before me. It's Ishtar that he's talking about. It's Astarte, and I can tell you why.
Is she also known as Liberty?
So the Liberty that's on the Capitol building in
Uh,
Washington D.C. Is that what you're talking
okay.
about? Yeah.
Well,
So that
yeah, I didn't know about that one specifically, but I just recently have come across Columbia, and and maybe Columbia is also Liberty. So I'm just wondering if
well,
they're one.
those were modern American. There's a million iterations on these goddesses and countless
Okay.
images and countless names, but there is those are both American versions of like using old ancient goddess imagery, absolutely. And
And
there's
you're
a ton
in the
of those
District of Columbia.
and I'm in Washington D.C., so I check out all this
Yeah.
stuff. Like there's
Wow.
all this. George Washington was a Grandmaster Freemason, and so they're into the occult. There's all sorts of Masonic symbolism embedded in the streets in Washington D.C. The Washington Monument is an Egyptian obelisk, which is a pagan occult symbol. And so there's a lot of that in with what the Freemasons were doing originally, which is why the Catholics always hated them. Um, but on top of the U.S. Capitol, there's a statue of I guess it's Lady Freedom or Lady Liberty or something. And yeah, it's like a goddess, and it's a blend of Roman and American Indian motifs. She's got like a Roman toga, but with like Native American head feathers. It's a really cool statue. You can Google it. It's on the top of the dome of the U.S. Capitol.
Okay, let me bring that up here. So you can keep going while I'm trying to get that
So
picture up.
anyway, historically, so the Israelites are Canaanites, and so they have, and we didn't used to have any Canaanite mythology. But they found some in the last century, and they're called the Ugaritic texts. And if you've never read them, you should really check them out. They are like the prequels to the Bible because they have all the same characters: Asherah, Astarte, Baal. They're all, and you see them in their own in their original religions going back to 1200 BC when those because they come from when the city of Ugarit fell and the Bronze Age collapsed around the year 1200, the same time that Troy fell, from the Trojan Wars. And so they found some mythology there, and it's really amazing stuff. It's really cool. And what we see among other things, another important topic to mention is that there's two names of God in the Bible, and this is key to understanding how the whole pagan story works. There's El and there's Yahweh. And El is usually shown as Elohim or Elyon or El Shaddai. There's a bunch of different titles. Mostly it's Elohim, which is just a generic word for God. Um, but El was like the traditional sky father. He's the traditional heavenly father of the Bronze Age that had been worshipped for thousands of years and is well known, well attested across the Bronze Age. He's the creator of the universe. He's the father of all the gods. He's Kronos to the Greeks. Um, and he was well
So
attested.
hold on, I didn't mean to jump in, but L, so Kronos and L are the same person, you're saying?
They're equivalents, yeah, because like
I've
the
never heard
Greeks,
that.
yeah. Well, it's they just don't talk about it because it's considered rude to describe the Bible as mythology. So no one
Okay.
makes these comparisons. Christian scholars don't make these comparisons, but
Okay.
um, but the Canaanites are also the Phoenicians out of Lebanon, and they were like the leading power in the beginning part of the Iron Age, the beginning part of the first millennium. And so the Greeks and the Phoenicians were interacting with each other all the time. And so the Greeks talk about the Phoenician gods. They discuss them, and not very favorably. Frankly, they don't like the Phoenicians. They were rivals for reasons we'll get into. Um, so they associated El with Kronos, and when they talk about child sacrifice, they say the Phoenicians are sacrificing their babies to Kronos, but in the Bible they're making the sacrifice to El. That's the Abraham and Isaac story. It's the
Wow.
sacrifices made to El. Um, and then they associate Rhea, who's the mother of the Olympian gods. She's the wife of Kronos. She's the mother of Zeus, the mother of the other Olympians. They associate her with Asherah, and also with Cybele, who's also another famous goddess who was very ancient, but also continued to be worshipped in Rome. She had a really long history. So Rhea, Cybele, and Asherah are equivalent mother goddesses and very, very old.
Wow. So there's a lot in there that I am not familiar with, but it's connecting so many dots for me right now. You're putting together so many different puzzle pieces for me, and it's okay. So when we go to El is Kronos and Yahweh is the spirit. So if we're talking
So
about
let me get
El,
to where Yahweh comes in.
okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So there's a historical context to this, which is so you've got the Bronze Age, which is the beginning of civilization when Sumer in Mesopotamia is the first civilization around 3500 BC, and then soon followed by China, India, and Egypt. But Sumer was just a little bit ahead of the curve of the others, and they invent the first writing with cuneiform, and they give us our first pantheons of the gods. And like the Mesopotamian gods are our oldest gods from these traditions, and we end up being able to draw them. Abraham also comes from Mesopotamia. So like all the Mesopotamian gods are like the root of the biblical stories. Um, and so right, so El is the equivalent of An in Mesopotamia, is equivalent of Kronos, because all the they
Anu.
An or Anu, yep, exactly.
Okay.
He's the sky father for the Sumerians. Um, And so, like, because like in the ancient world, they recognized all these equivalencies among the gods. The Greeks talked about it openly that when they're describing foreign cultures, they would equate their gods with the foreign gods. They do it with the Egyptian gods. I mean, their
Right.
literature is full of this stuff. Um, and so El and On, they've been around forever. And then you've got basically almost more than 2,000 years of history. And then you get the Bronze Age collapse. Have you heard about the Bronze Age collapse? So around the year 1200 is a complete catastrophe, and all of the leading powers around the Mediterranean and the Near East completely dissolve and like fall away. And there's 200-year dark age where there's no governance, no trade, no literacy. It's a complete dark age across
So
the
like a
Near
Mad
East.
Max type of post-apocalyptic world.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's not quite that bad, but it's pretty bad. And that goes from the year 1200 to the year 1000, roughly speaking. Just to put it in simple terms. Um, it doesn't start in one day, it doesn't end in one day, but basically for 200 years there, you've got no governance at all, and cuneiform, the old forms of writing, all break down and never come back again. And so from the year 1000 going forward, we're now into the Iron Age. Part of what happens is bronze gets replaced by iron. Um, and so we're now in the Iron Age. And this is where we get classical antiquity. This is where the Hebrews emerge onto the world stage. This is where the Greeks come out. They all come in after the Bronze Age collapse. And part of what happens is they invent new gods, new religions, and new cultures emerge. And Zeus and the Olympian gods and Yahweh are both invented at this time. They both are not, they do not exist in the Bronze Age. But they're Iron Age gods, and they are invented out of whole cloth at this time. And Yahweh first comes onto the scene, around 1100 or 1200 BC. There's no mention of Yahweh before that. And
Mm.
so, and he's a reformer. Yahweh's got the followers of Yahweh they're reformers, and it's a reformation that happens, and they want to make some changes. The three big things that they're trying to change are ending idolatry, which is that, they talk about that a lot in the Bible. They want to end idolatry. That's because in those days, they genuinely believed that the gods were in these statues, and they would put clothes on the statues, and the priests would feed the statues, and they would haul them out for religious ceremonies and go through all these elaborate processions with these stone idols. And the Hebrews are saying, the Yahwists are saying, the Yahwists are the followers of Yahweh. They're saying, that this is a dumb tradition. Let's stop doing this. And so that's when they want to break down the golden calf. That Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and wants to break down the golden calf. That's, an example of idolatry. And the golden calf was what they used to worship El. So when Yahweh first comes on the scene, he's just,
Wow, hold on. So the golden calf is used to worship El.
yeah.
So I was under and I guess it might still be this, but I was under the impression that was Baal or Baal, however you say his name.
So Baal rules with the authority of his
Baal.
father El. And they're both use the title of
Wow.
Bull of Heaven. And it's like, because the thing about the Sky Father is he's the father of all the gods, and he's removed from human affairs. He's like out in space. He's not really messing around with people. It's his children that are all the pantheon of the gods, and they're the ones that people interact with. So his son Baal rules with the authority of his father El, and they both
Wow.
are called the Bull. And the Bull of Heaven, because they're cattle cults and they're shepherds, and the cattle cults go way back, and they still exist today in India and Africa and places. People have been worshiping cattle forever, and that's what the Bull of Heaven is about. And the golden calf is this symbol of El. So when Yahweh comes along, he's just another pagan god. He's one of the many sons of El, and he's competing with Baal to be the new Lord. He wants to knock Baal out, and this story takes over in the Old Testament with it's Yahweh up against Baal to be the new Lord, and Yahweh eventually wins.
So, I just want to jump in there real quick again. Is that Yahweh? I believe was also a son of Enlil. I've come across that before. That
I wouldn't
Enlil
say
from
he's a
the
son of
Anunnaki.
Enlil. He occupies the same position as Enlil. They're both the king of the gods. They're
Okay,
both the sons of El. Um, yeah, they're sort of in this same position as all these kings of the gods. There's a ton of kings of the gods because every culture's got their own. In Babylon, it's Marduk.
right,
The Assyrians, it's Ashur. In Greece, it's Zeus. But before that, actually in the Mycenaean time, Poseidon was the high god, but it wasn't really the same Poseidon. Um, and Zeus didn't exist before. You've got Indra in India. So in these Indo-European traditions, the king of the gods is always the warrior storm god. And so all these traditions have a warrior storm god as the king. And so
wow,
Baal was the old one, Yahweh's the young one, and Yahweh's trying to knock him out. Because one of the things that's bad about Baal is that they have child sacrifice, and that they really did have this practice of slicing their infants' throats and throwing the babies in the fire. And this is a Phoenician practice that was documented all over the Mediterranean, wherever the Phoenicians were. And the Greeks and Romans wrote about it just as much as the Hebrews in the Bible do. And the Greeks and Romans also thought it was completely barbarous and disgusting and horrible and tragic and futile and a terrible thing to do. And they really thought the Phoenicians were quite atrocious for that behavior. And when part of the reason why we don't have any Phoenician writing is because the Greeks and the Romans really hated them. And this is my theory anyway. And the Greeks and Romans burned out all their cities and destroyed all their writings. And so we don't really have Phoenician writings except for stuff the archaeologists have found recently.
wow. All right, so I want to go back just a little bit. So before I get into that, I have psychic abilities that have been granted to me in the last 2 years, and
Okay.
when I meditate, I get into these deep meditations, and I can experience these amazing things. And one time, a few months ago, I actually had YHWH inscribed on my throat. As so, I used to think along these lines that Yahweh was a physical being. As I said, I have come across information that said that it was Enlil's son, maybe an equivalent to Enlil, but I heard them as used in one and the same. And then I had Yahweh inscribed on my throat, and what I was told was Yahweh is the breath of life, and he was named after the breath of life. So maybe he came into physical form in some sense to get rid of all that bad stuff that you were mentioning that he was doing. So that's amazing in itself. But then I've read three Enoch. So there's three books of Enoch, and only the first one is really accepted by most people. But the third one is completely different than the other two. So two Enoch is kind of like one Enoch, but three Enoch completely different. It was a Jewish rabbi in 90 A.D. He went on this, I don't know if it's a psychedelic trip, maybe he went to sleep, something where his spirit traveled up to heaven and he met Enoch, who it was revealed to him was Metatron, the archangel Metatron. And he's seeing all these different things, and he's describing seeing 20 different beings called Yahweh. So there were 20 different beings up there named Yahweh, and what it is, it's the fractal nature of reality. That everything's repeating itself on a more grand scale. So when he would go see one person named Yahweh, then he would go up to the next dimension, for lack of a better word, and he would see another person named Yahweh doing the same thing as the one below him, but they were Yah. It was something Yahweh. They had two names, and Yahweh was their last name. There was 20 of them. So it's what you're bringing here, that makes so much more sense in that we were maybe on a higher dimensional scale in our past, and that humanity somehow fell down deeper into it, and that's where these new gods appeared at that time. In that in some sense, I don't know how it works, but in some way we went further into the dream. It was like Inception. We went one layer deeper somehow. This is the type of thing that I'm picking up on right now.
All right. Yeah, I never read the book of Enoch. I just try to look at this stuff at a pretty like straight historical level, and I really try to understand the cultural implications on the ground rather than like sort of the high-minded theology of it all. I was trying to understand, because this is where we get into the goddesses, because this is actually where we starts to get into something we can relate to. So I had a theory, I was like, all right, so they threw this goddess out. They threw out this Asherah at some point. I have a theory that Asherah and cannabis got thrown out together, and that was my hypothesis that I got into this whole research on, and that actually ends up being totally true. That cannabis is totally sacred to these goddesses because what they are is it's Mother Earth. We know her well. It's Mother Earth. It's Mother Nature. The Native Americans teach us about it. And so everything is rooted in the cycles of life and nature and fertility. And they're always referred to as fertility cults in scholarship. And the Christians always call these fertility religions. And, and they basically are. These are farmers. So one of the symbols is the farmers and the shepherds. The Israelites are a shepherding clan. They make this very clear. And this metaphor extends into Christianity, where they still talk about the pastor as the shepherd of his flock. That's because they were shepherds, and that was put them in contrast with the farmers. The farmers were the people in the cities, which is different than we think of it now. But the farmers are the first people to come in with settlements, and these settlements become the first cities. So the people living in the cities, they're represented as the farmers, and they worship the goddesses, and they have these fertility religions where everything is concerned about promoting the growth of plants and a healthy harvest, and it's all about that. And they believe that sex makes the flowers grow, and they celebrated sexuality, and sexuality was put on display, and women's sexuality in particular was put on display. And they have ritual prostitution, but it's run by women, and the women keep the money. And these goddess temples, which are totally sex temples, are run by women. And they also have the plant drugs, which, because like, again, this is women's business. The women are the potion makers, the women are the midwives and the nurses, and the women do the weaving too. So this all brings us back to cannabis, because cannabis isn't just an intoxicant, it's also a fiber, and it's a medicine. And as a medicine, it's particularly useful. It's an aphrodisiac, and it's particularly useful for women as like a midwifery medicine, and they can use it for menstrual stuff, and they can even use it in abortions. So cannabis is like really ends up being really, really sacred to the women because it tracks all the stuff they do and all the aspects of their religion. And one of the things that cannabis is, the fibers, the hemp fibers, is that they were used to ritually to for burying the dead and also for newborns. So is the fiber that in China they talk about this. It's the alpha and the omega, which is the same thing we see in the Bible. It's the alpha and the omega because it's the fiber that wraps the newborn in the corpse. It's the first fiber that touches your body as a newborn. It's the last fiber that touches you on your way out as a when you die. You're buried in it, and it's this fiber that's woven by women ritually because it also has these other uses as, like I said, an aphrodisiac. If you've got a sex-based religion and you've got a plant that's an aphrodisiac, you can imagine that's like pretty popular
Right.
stuff.
Right.
Um,
I want to give you a little synchronicity. On my way home, I'm listening to Tinfoil Hat, and Christopher Knowles was on there. And at the very end, it was his latest episode. So it was titled like Transgender Spirits or something like that.
the
At
trans people are there too.
right at the very end, he started talking about these temples that were of angels, but they look like women, but they're described as men. And he's saying that these, what you're saying, that this was for prostitution. And he said that the word Malachi in Hebrew sounds a lot like the word malakoi in Greek, and malakoi means something along the lines of prostitute, where Malachi means angel. And it's like, whoa, what exactly was going on there? And now you're bringing this, the synchronicities
Yeah, so
with
they're
this
they're
is
in
off
the
the
they're in the
chart.
Bible. So in the Bible, the priestesses are called the Kadesha, and there
Yeah,
are
that's what he was saying.
and they're
Wow.
distinguished from a common. There's a different word for a common prostitute. In an English text, they both get translated as harlot. And the King James Bible does not distinguish between a zona, which is the Hebrew word for a regular street prostitute, a brothel prostitute, and
Arizona.
a kadesha, yeah, Zonah,
Right.
is the a brothel prostitute. But a kadesha is a priestess, and the kadesh are the male counterparts who are trans. A lot of them are trans, are eunuchs, because people would be they would voluntarily castrate themselves in service of the goddess, and that transgenderism was totally celebrated in the ancient world, and
So,
they're all over the place
they would castrate themselves for what reason?
in service of the goddess. The goddesses loved trans people. They were absolutely celebrated as mystics and shamans.
So a man would cut off his penis
Cut off his
just to,
nut, cut off his testicles.
okay,
Just like we castrate animals, we do it routinely to dogs and
so he would do it just to so he could continually have sex with the
no,
woman, or
they don't have sex anymore. You become impotent when you castrate yourself, but it's being transgender,
uh,
and it was super common in the ancient world, and they're in the
okay,
Bible.
so this would make the man then transgender.
Yeah,
Wow. And you see the trans movement that's happening today.
and people don't even realize the history that for thousands and thousands of years, trans people were open and
So
public
would
and
they
celebrated.
invert the penis as well? Do you know about that,
No,
or
I don't think they had all that elaborate surgery. I think they just did castrations. I think but the castration is actually pretty elaborate. So you don't. There's a technique to it, so you don't bleed to death.
I got
Um,
to tell you, Ed, you are blowing my mind, and I can tell that you are so studied in this because
I've been studying for a while. Yeah.
yeah, you're just free flowing, and I can tell that this is not something that you just put together. That this is amazing what you've presented so far. I mean, just
Well,
the
thanks. I pulled on a thread. I'm not a specialist in any of this stuff. I just and I gotta make it really gotta stress this. I could not have done this without the internet. It literally would not. Nobody could have done this research 20 years ago because you had to have been
right.
a super specialist to get access to this information. And if I didn't tell the story, somebody else was going to do it. It was just begging to be told, because I just started pulling on a thread and just started following where it led me. And it's not. I just followed a logical thread, and
Yeah.
anybody
Is
could
your
have done it.
book is your book audio, or is it just
I don't
a
have an
text?
audio version of it. I would
Okay,
love to
I
do
got
more
you.
podcasts and stuff, but like I don't really have the bandwidth or the technique to do it on my own. Of like just I don't know. I have not. I've been trying to make videos, but I've not been very successful at it. So I'd love to work with somebody. If anyone's listening, wants to do a podcast with me, that can like do all the editing and post production stuff, so I don't have to do it.
Hey, maybe we'll talk after the show. Yeah.
Because I've been trying and sort of flailing around at doing it just solo. I've been doing this work solo and been trying to get the word out, and it's been a little frustrating to try and get the word out more.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, I got to tell you, you are going to blow a lot of minds very, very soon.
I hope so. I think so.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk a little bit more about that after the show. But so I wanted to go back to when you were talking about El. See, Israel,
Israel, exactly.
yeah, yeah,
And
Ishtar, Ra, and El. So now, but with Asherah, that's making me think of something very different. Maybe it's to her. So, what is your take on Israel?
Israel means wrestles with El. It's doesn't it's not Isra is one word, and it means like wrestles
Okay.
with, contends with.
Oh, okay.
And
Say I never heard that. I
yeah,
always
no,
heard it was Isis, Ra, and El.
no. You gotta the Egyptian. We can talk about the Egyptian gods. Egyptian gods are important, and they're a big influence here too. But they actually have a separate pantheon. So the Indo-European gods have Earth Mother, Sky Father. The son of the gods is this. The king of the gods is always this warrior storm god. That's all Indo-European, but the Egyptian pantheon is different. The Egyptian pantheon, Ra is the sky father. He's not the sky father. He's the creator of the universe, but he's the sun god. Um, and the moon is female. And so anytime you see that stuff where it's the sun is the high god, that's Egyptian and that's Ra. But if it's sky, heavenly father or sky father and earth mother, that's Indo-European.
Well, you have a ton of knowledge of this ancient stuff, and I love the ancient stuff. So,
Well, it's interesting
this
because
is
the
great.
Indo-Europeans are all, it's a common pattern. Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, and Canaan, it's all one, it's a common pattern, and they just changed the names. And but that doesn't fit with Egypt. Egypt is like equally old, but it's a totally different like thing. Like they have the earth is male and the sky is female. Like they're totally different. The Egyptian pantheon is totally different.
So, what is your take on, with all this knowledge you put together, on where we are? Because the picture I'm getting is that maybe Earth is a kind of a dumpster where things were grown at an experiment, and that there was different beings coming down at different times to try to grow their own superior race, and that they were kind of making us fight for supremacy. That's just the idea that's coming into my mind right now, is that the picture that you're painting with uh, so many different at different points of history, there were mothers and fathers, or different, as you're saying, different sons of the father, that are all ruling over here and telling people what to do. It kind of seems like this is a battlefield, that someone's just playing a game with us to get us all to fight because they are competing with each other.
Well, I do think the gods are all projections of the human mind, and that they represent our culture. They represent different cultures, and they're very much like mascots, like team mascots, like the New York, the Boston Celtic, or the Seattle Seahawk. Um, they're like banners that we rally around and definitely go to war around. There's no question about it. We definitely fight over the gods, and spiritual warfare is like not just an expression. It's actually like describes conflict between different cultures, and where a battle between the gods is reflecting a battle between cultures. Actually, this is a big part of my whole theory, that the Greeks have a history of the gods. They call it the theogony, where they talk about how Zeus came to power. He defeated the older gods that were the Titans, and they talk about Gaia was the earth, and they have a whole history of the whole thing. I actually think that represents actual human history, and that those are reflecting different time periods in human history and the development of human religions and different cultures. So that the first generation is Gaia, and she's the virgin mother all by herself. The origin of creation is female, was a virgin mother of the universe.
Right.
She
And
gives
she
birth
got
to her.
filled with the male
She gives birth
spirit.
to her own husband. She gives birth to her own mate, and then they are the original divine
Oh,
couple.
yeah, because there's always that mother-son relationship. Mimi and I were talking about this not too long ago, in that the mother gives birth to the son, and then they have sex together, and then the woman gives birth to another son, and or I'm sorry, gives birth to a daughter, and then she gives birth to another son, and it just keeps going on where it's the mom and the son, and then the son becomes the husband, and it's a very weird type of
Well,
thing.
definitely with the very primordial first couple, that is what it's like. That the very origins of creation in these beliefs was female, and the origin of the universe is female, gives birth to her own husband, and then they are the parents of the original generation of gods. And so then in the Greek traditions, the first things that come out are are the monsters, cyclopses and monsters,
Hmm.
and they're pretty gnarly. Um, and when you look at the Neolithic era, like Çatalhöyük in particular, which is like, the earliest Neolithic settlements in Turkey, they don't have anthropomorphic gods. They have a ton of art, but none of things like anthropomorphic. It's all like crazy images, and it's bulls and vultures and animals and sort of like monstrous sort of creatures. I liken that to the monsters the Greeks are describing. Then you get to the Bronze Age, and now we actually have anthropomorphic gods, like gods that look like people, and we have stories about them that are reflective of the patterns of like they modeled the gods after their own governments. Like they have a king of the gods. There was no king of the gods before there were kings of people. Like the king of the gods gets invented at the same time we start having kings, because they want the divine order to reflect the human order, right? Um, and so that's when we get into that. Then those are the Bronze Age gods, and those are the Titans. Then you've got 2,000 years of that. The Bronze Age collapse, and that's when Zeus comes in with the Olympians and fight off the Bronze Age gods and establish their order. And that's the same thing Yahweh's doing. Yahweh's also fighting off of Bronze Age gods, but instead of where Zeus reorders the divine council in his image, in particular, he takes all the goddesses, because the Bronze Age goddesses are powerful. They're from the era of the matriarchy, and they are not submissive to any males. Asherah is not submissive to El. Ishtar, in particular, is not submissive to any males ever. She's a totally dominant force of the universe. And then there's another goddess, Anat, who is like the goddess of death and slaughter, and she'll destroy everything, including El. And so um,
She did destroy El, you're saying, or she would have?
she has the capability
Or she
to,
could have, I meant. Oh,
or
wow.
in the future she will someday, because someday she'll eat the entire universe, and that's my version of it. Um, so you've got these very powerful Bronze Age goddesses, but as the patriarchy comes along, they can't have these characters out there. They can't have these stories out there. They can't have their daughters growing up hearing stories about Ishtar, who defies her father, who challenges all the other gods for authority, who is totally promiscuous, totally non-monogamous, does not believe in monogamy as a matter of principle, who celebrates her prostitution. I mean, she's like a porn star goddess. It's extremely sexual stuff and very, very like R-rated.
It's sex
Um,
cult type stuff.
I mean, it's all explicit sex, and there's a ton of explicit sex in Sumerian mythology. It's really quite funny. Um, and so in this reformation they have in the Iron Age, they've got to get rid of these goddesses, because you can't have, otherwise they can't keep their women under control. They want to institute patriarchy. They want to institute paternity. That's one of the things, is paternal bloodlines versus maternal bloodlines. If you track birth through the mother, it doesn't really matter who the women are having sex with, because you're not tracking the seed. This is something that shifts over. The Greeks do it too. The Greeks and the Hebrews have like parallel cultural shifts where they're instituting patriarchy and instituting paternity, because it didn't used to be that way. And then they write a history of the world where there never was a goddess, at least in the Bible. They write a new history of the world where there never was a goddess, and it's been paternity since the beginning of time, back to Adam and Eve. And they make you think that that's the way it's always been, but actually that was just a whitewashing of history, and ignoring the thousands of years of history where goddesses were in charge and there was matriarchy and the men weren't in charge. Um,
Wow, this is great stuff. So I'm very well versed on the Book of Enoch. I have a little 3-part series on YouTube and my audio feed as well on breaking it down with the way that my psychic abilities work. My third eye just starts working when someone's talking to me. As you're talking to me, I'm envisioning the words that you're saying. When I'm reading the Book of Enoch, I'm envisioning the things that I'm reading or listening to. So I've also had encounters with very biblical things like the the being with the face of a man, the face of an eagle, the face of a ox, and the face of a lion. You know, the four heads. I've encountered that being in a meditation, and I've also seen it literally in the clouds. And I have pictures. Maybe not. I don't know if
Is that
those
from
pictures came as
Ezekiel
good.
or Isaiah? Which one
Yeah,
is it?
yeah, yeah. Ezekiel. I've also encountered
I always
the
figured he was just tripping.
well, yeah, see, that's the thing is that that we don't take these things literal because we can't imagine it because our pineal glands are so closed. But also the beast of Revelation with 7 heads and 10 horns, I've seen that exactly as it's described. It was red, but it was in the astral world, so it was in the fourth dimension. So it was just an outline. It's a hologram. It's a blueprint, but it was red instead of being blue. It was red, exactly as it's described, but it was the 7 heads. Each one was a different color of the chakra system, but it was reversed, and the red was at the top. And he looked at me and he roared at me, and it looked like a lion roaring in my face, and it was huge. It was way bigger than I was. And then it closed its mouth, and I saw it was a Chinese dragon, and then I saw its one arm, and it had bear claws, and I was like blown away. But I started laughing because I was like, "Oh, you can't hurt me. I'm physical." You know, it was trying to scare me away from going to where I went to next. But you know, I've encountered so many different crazy things, and the way my third eye works, and my intuitive abilities, and claircognizance, clairsentience, all these things lead me to understand that all of these ancient cultures are literally saying what literally happened. But we, as who we are now and where we are in history, we can't understand it. So we interpret it as metaphor. But it also is exactly as you're saying, it is describing what's happening here because of the term as above, so below. So it's happening on their scale as it's happening on our scale. Like I was saying, it's like an inception dream, and we went further down. So it is happening up there, like on all these other dimensions, but it is happening exactly as they're describing it. And there was some point in history where the fallen angels came down, and this is what I'm getting is that these goddesses, these female goddesses that you're describing, weren't actually female; that they're androgynous, transgender maybe is another term, but I'm picking up on androgynous beings that were making everything about sex worship and that type of thing. So this is just all coming together in the way that the fallen angels actually worked, and how we had created Nephilim and all these monsters that the Greeks describe. Are you familiar with the Nephilim?
Hmm.
Yes, so that's kind of, I talked to a guy who thinks that the dinosaurs were actually maybe Nephilim, and he has evidence, not evidence, not physical evidence, but through his interpretation of different texts, that dinosaurs, different reptiles, were possibly Nephilim, and that these monsters, these cyclops, were Nephilim. And the way that I've come to know that the people who are in charge now, I don't use the word elite because that means the people of God, and they are not the people of God. So I don't use that term for them. But the rulers of this realm, they covered up all the giants in our history because it's their blood relatives, that they were used to be giants, and that's why they ruled over us. And now they're the same size as us because, as you were saying, at first they were monsters, and then like the third generation, they finally started to look human, because what had to happen was the fallen had to mix human DNA with their DNA in order to make the Nephilim the next generation, because the Nephilim couldn't reproduce with themselves. So when they got to what you're saying, the third iteration, they finally looked human, and that's when they were giant. They were like 12-foot tall giants, 15-foot tall giants. Uh, but before that, they were monstrous dinosaurs, or something to that effect, and cyclopses, and all these different beasts. So eventually, they kept dying off, and they would get smaller and smaller by mixing more human DNA with the Nephilim DNA, and they had to become smaller because they had to have more human DNA in order to maintain them in this world, because some kind of event occurred where a ton of oxygen and carbon dioxide left this oxygenated place, this dome that we're in, and so everything was shrinking, has been shrinking over time because of the oxygen carbon dioxide levels. So everything you're telling me right now is blowing my mind so much. It's completing my picture of what is going on so much.
Well, how about the Younger Dryas extinction?
Okay, let's go with that.
Do you
What do
know
you got
about
with
that
that?
event?
I do know about the younger dries. I'll give you, so before you go on, because I'm sure you're more researched than what I'm going to say. But what I get from it is that the moon was somehow put in place that stopped the younger dryas. That the moon, it didn't exist before the younger dryas. And there's actually ancient cultures that talk about there was no moon. You know, that the moon being put in place around that time, and so the moon being connected to the waters makes me think that the waters were then moved to the poles, you know, that they're not supposed to be there, and because it was an overflow of water there, then it started freezing, and that is what's causing the wobble. And there's not supposed to be a wobble of the earth, but it's being caused by the moon being drug into our atmosphere. And I think that maybe the moon might be Nibiru, the great destroyer that came in and uh, destroyed the world by putting it on this wobble.
All right. Well, I've never heard that theory. I mean, the Younger Dryas is only 12,000 years ago, so
Right, right.
that was not that long ago. So for the moon to be have only been put there 12,000 years ago would be pretty radical stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
if around 10,000 BC, you can find civilizations talking about, you know, right when the Younger Dryas was letting up, that there was no moon, and then all of a sudden that there is, and there's evidence to suggest that it's not from, you know, some people thought it was possibly from the Earth, but it actually doesn't match up from the Earth, and other people thought that it was from the asteroid belt that's in between Mars and Jupiter, and then there's evidence that it's not from that, that it's actually something that foreign, that they're not sure where it comes from, actually, you know, in today's science.
all right. Well, the theory I was talking about, which is different, is that there's a comet strike. So as we're coming out of the ice age, the glacial maximum is like 18,000 years ago or so, 20,000 years ago, and then for a couple thousand years, it's a pretty steady. We're warming up pretty steadily. The ice was like 2 miles thick in places, and it comes down all across North America, all of Canada, all the way down as far south as New York City is all ice. And same in North and Europe too, like Scandinavian countries, it's all covered in ice. The sea levels were 400 feet lower. The coastlines are completely different. There's a land bridge from North America, et cetera, et cetera. So the theory is that, and so we've known that like the woolly mammoth and the saber-tooth tigers, the other big animals all went extinct around that time.
Right, the
Um,
megafauna.
exactly
85%
the
of North
megafauna.
American megafauna went
All the
extinct.
large animals go away, and there was like there's not really a clear explanation for why. And human populations got devastated as well. And so what people are starting to realize now is that there's increasing evidence that there was a comet strike, or something happened. But a comet strike is a pretty leading theory. Perhaps multiple strikes, like from the same comet breaking up. Um, and so the theory is that a comet strike hit the North American ice cap and was absolutely devastating, and that it's a really dramatic, not a small comet strike, like a major comet strike,
Right.
and so that it wipes out everything, and but doesn't destroy life in the oceans. It's only wiping out life on the surface, and
Hmm.
that one of the things it does is it, you can imagine, this is totally just a speculative theory. The way I imagine it, though, is that as the ice was melting, it's forming big inland seas, or even at least lakes, if not
Right.
giant seas. They'd just be puddles on top of the glaciers, but in effect, it's like an inland lake or an inland sea. So when a comet strike comes and smashes that and releases all the water into the oceans. I mean, we have evidence in North America of like these sudden gushers that tore across the landscape with massive waterfalls, that dwarf Niagara. So there is geological evidence of these massive torrents of water. And so the theory is that, it causes like the sea levels to rise dramatically, like 40 feet in a 24-hour period. I mean, over time they rose 400 feet, but you can imagine if there was a
At
dramatic
40 feet,
event.
that's huge.
Yeah, if that happened in a 24-hour period, that would devastate all coastal communities all over the
Right.
world, right?
Yeah.
Because most people live on the coast. And so you would have just this massive wipeout of life and of civilization, and whatever civilizations that existed would have been totally devastated. And so then you have 90% of humanity is killed, and just the survivors, survive through this, centuries long cataclysm. And then when they finally, the weather finally improves, the survivors are the ones who start the Neolithic Revolution. That they've been scarred, they've been, totally traumatized by having to live in caves or whatever they were doing to survive, to eke out their survival. That would be the Mad Max,
Okay.
the real Mad Max devastation. Um, and I kind of have a sense that those stories are rooted in some sort of memory like
Yeah,
that,
I agree.
Um, and also,
Have you heard about the Great Plains? That they're the Great Plains because glaciers, as they melted, they were gliding across the ground and just flattening everything in its path.
oh yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Randall
I lived
Carlson
in the
said
Finger
that.
Lakes in New York for a long time,
Okay.
and they were carved out by glaciers too. Um, so the theory is that you've got the survivors of the Younger Dryas, these traumatized survivors in the Fertile Crescent. That that was one of the places where they could eat, where they were able to live along the coast of the Mediterranean. And those are the people that begin the Neolithic, and that's the Fertile Crescent, which ends up being the same territory of the Bible. These are the places that were the first settlements. Jericho, the city in Jericho, like where they bring the walls down, that had been inhabited for 7,000 years prior to Joshua showing up.
You said it hadn't been
It had been
inhabited?
inhabited.
Okay.
Today, it's been inhabited for 10,000 years. People have been living there. They call it the oldest city on earth. People have been
Wow.
living there for 7,000 years before the events of the Bible.
Yeah, I just actually read something yesterday that there's this new scientific discovery that there was some kind of comet hit this city called El Talahum in the Middle East, and
Oh, I
if
saw that.
yeah, 14 miles away was Jericho, and that the force of the impact was so strong that the wind knocked down the walls of Jericho as that comet or whatever meteor
Right.
hit.
Yeah. So the thing with that theory was that they were actually describing a comet at the Younger Dryas. They're describing the
Right.
same Younger Dryas burn marks. But
Right.
Jericho, they dated the walls of Jericho. The walls aren't that old. The,
Okay.
they know when the walls fell down. It was around 1500 BC. It was before the Israelites showed up, and it came down in these earthquakes that they know happened. It's actually a pretty
Okay.
earthquake prone territory, and so the archaeologists have figured out that those walls were already down before the Israelites showed up, and the Israelites were basically just telling folk tales, talking about, you see those ruins over there? Our guys did that centuries ago, but it's all just stories.
Okay. Th- So this is just all such great information. Uh, and you're fine. The Younger Dryas. So what do you think stopped it? Because what I was saying with the moon, I think it was stopping the Younger Dryas, but I agree
Well,
that there was
I mean,
something
I think
that
the moon
came
was
in.
already there. I'm pretty sure the moon has been around for. I'm not an expert on the moon, but as far as I know, it's been around for a long time. But as far as the Earth having a wobble, that's true. That's been documented. I've seen that, and
Right, as a
I think that can come from comet strikes. I think we've been hit by comets probably a lot of times over the years. I think extraterrestrial impacts are actually pretty common, and so the Earth's probably been slammed pretty hard a few times, and enough that at one point or another it got knocked off its axis. And any
right.
one of these, who knows how long it's been off its axis.
Right, and there's the legend that we're on a 25,920 year
Yeah, that's the Mayan
procession.
calendar.
Right, and so maybe, I don't understand how time works in the way that we're told. I don't think it's a constant. I don't, because there's so many
Well, this
things
is
that
an
line
important
up.
point. In the goddesses versus God, a lot of things change over. One of the things that when the goddesses were in charge was that time was circular. And when the patriarchy comes in, they start putting things in linear
Linear.
terms,
Well,
and everything becomes linear. But they used to talk about time in circular terms, and they didn't have a linear calendar. And
hmm.
that's circular, the cycle of life, goddess thinking.
Yeah, and the woman is the curve where the man is a straight line. So,
Right, the I and the O.
you're right. So, wow. Wow, I got my mind is expanding so much in this conversation. So back to I want to take it back to kind of how it relates to today's day and age and what's going on, because a lot of what you're saying, my mind is branching off and listening to how it was back then, but it's also relating to what's going on today. And it was very interesting that Liberty and Lady Liberty and Columbia are the American versions of this female goddess, and now we have the transgender movement as popular as it is, and I
Yeah,
think
I
it's
mean,
probably
a big part of the reason why I wrote the book was that I recognized that everything that was going on in these goddesses and that the stuff that they're fighting about and that the reformers are trying to get rid of totally mirrors today's culture wars right down the line.
yeah.
Feminism, environmentalism, nature worship, um, sexual freedom for gays and for transgenders separately, and for women, um, plant drugs, cannabis and psychedelics, abortions. This is all, socialism, like radical egalitarianism. That's, again, a matriarchal tradition that in these
Mhm.
matriarchal cultures, um, they didn't have dominance hierarchies. They didn't have war and slavery.
Well, were they matriarchy or were they androgynous, transgender? Were they, both genders, or were they women?
Well, when I say matriarchy, really what I'm talking about are cultures that are egalitarian, where the men are not dominating the women, but the men and women have equal rights, and the
Okay.
guy and the women are respected. And in those religions, transgendered people are, have a public role, and they are, they're high priests and shamans, and they have like a they're celebrated. And they have a role. It's not that they don't still have women. You still have like femininity and motherhood is still represented, because I mean that's one thing about trans people is that they're not, reproducing, really, generally speaking. Um, so like the motherhood is still celebrated, but the trans people are 100% represented. They're like
Right.
have like a very esteemed
It kind of
location.
seems to me that it's androgynous beings, not that women are actually leading it, but it's androgyny, that it's the hermaphrodites that are leading. Well, maybe not hermaphrodite because I know only one works, but maybe androgynous, in where it is actually still not a woman leading, that the woman is still being led by someone with a penis, but
Like
it's just in a different sense, a completely
in
different sense.
in Native American cultures and in a lot of tribal cultures, they'll have a male who's the chief of the tribe, right? But
Right.
but he gets chosen in North American Native Americans. It's like this. Um, that male leader is chosen by a council of women. Like there's a council of women, and they choose the leader, they choose the chief, and then the chief in turn that choice needs to be approved by the rest of the tribe. So it's a type of democracy, but it doesn't have politicians or voting or anything like that. But it is democracy because the people do have to approve. But it's the council of women that choose the man. And I kind of think that that's what was going on in the ancient world, and that as the patriarchy only starts to assert itself with the Bronze Age and with the invention of weapons. Like with bronze gives us swords and chariots and shields and armor. None of that stuff existed before the invention of bronze. And that's when the men start to assert themselves over women, and the patriarchy asserts itself over these older matriarchal cultures. And they spend a pretty long time, the shepherd kings, I call them, take a couple thousand years to throw off the women, so they don't have to listen to the women anymore. They don't have to, there's no women choosing the tribal chief. There's no sacred marriage where the women give consent to the king to give their approval for him ruling. There was all these elements of pagan culture where the women had very, very important roles. Even though there was a war king, even though there was a male king, the women still had very, very important roles in picking the king or approving the king or just consenting to the king, whatever. Um, that eventually, by the time you get to the Greeks and the Old Testament, and you get certainly the Christian era, like there's none of that. The women have been completely pushed out. They've been made completely subordinate. They have no role in public society, and leadership roles in public life at all.
Hmm.
Um, and part of what happens is the mythology's got to change. You got to eliminate these goddesses that demonstrate independence and authority, and have goddesses that are completely subordinate. All the Greek goddesses are subordinate to Zeus. Not one of the Greek goddesses challenges Zeus's authority at all. Hera, his wife, spends all of her time chasing Zeus is a philanderer. He runs around womanizing, having sex with as many women as possible. And Hera's response is always to go destroy the women. She doesn't attack Zeus. She doesn't challenge Zeus. She goes and destroys the women. And she spends all of her time, pretty much every story about Hera has her being a jealous, nasty scold that is out hunting down the women that Zeus has had sex with and their children. But she never challenges Zeus. Athena
Wow.
never challenges Zeus. None of the goddesses challenge Zeus. Um,
Yeah. So it is very interesting in how it has been male dominated. I don't, that's something
but
I'll
to
have
bring it
to
back, you were asking about
start
today.
meditating on.
So what's happening today, though, is the feminine divine is coming back. Ever since the Industrial Revolution has shifted the landscape of human culture, the Industrial Revolution and slavery. The Industrial Revolution does a lot of things, but it changes the dynamics for men and women's day to day relationships, and it gives the margin for women to start pressing for their rights, which is playing out over an extended period of time, over many generations. It doesn't happen overnight, but slowly but surely, women have been demanding and getting their rights back and their power back, and the feminine divine is being recognized, and people are doing work like me. I'm not the first person to go down this path. I learned from a bunch of other previous writers before me that taught me this stuff. And the feminine divine is being rediscovered. The goddess is coming back. And actually, the Christians are talking about this. There's a whole YouTube series by this fundamentalist Christian preacher who's talking about warning about the goddess and warning about the feminine divine returning and saying this is a problem.
So
Um,
that's where I'm interested in is what was occurring that made the males want to do this, because the picture you're painting for me is that there were these androgynous beings that were allowing that had the women up on a higher scale than they are now, and for some reason something was going on to the point that male figures, Zeus, as you're saying, had to become so dominant, so powerful to keep the women down. I don't think that it's in today's terms, we look at patriarchy as, oh, men are just trying to keep women down. It doesn't seem like that was the case, because it seems like this was a very deprived type of cultures in and having sex cults all over the place. And this is not what God, the spirit of all of us, the life force of us all, God, Yahweh, wants for any of us to worship people, to worship uh, cattle, as you were talking about earlier with the bull, with false idols. We shouldn't have those things, and we shouldn't be having sex cults. We shouldn't just be having sex with just anybody. And in the way that was being described. There's something there that there is a reason why the male had to take out the androgynous, because maybe
I agree. I
the
agree. I think
female
that
was going along with it.
there is I think these cultural trends happen for a reason. Um, I think that those sex cults, I think they probably were pretty innocent back in the day, back in like way back in the day, like the Neolithic tribal era. But by the time you get to the late, in the Iron Age, these things are probably pretty corrupted.
Well,
They're
when we're
probably
talking about genital mutilation, that is not something that, and I don't mean to offend anybody listening or yourself or anything, but we're talking about genital mutilation. That is a very serious type of thing
I
that's
mean, we do
occurring.
it
So I
today.
don't, I
We
don't,
circumcise children today.
yeah, exactly. I don't agree with that. Now that I learned what I learned, and what we do to animals too. We just spade and
I
neuter
mean, the
your pets.
castration. I mean, you can judge
Yeah.
it however you want, but it was super common. Um, it
Right. So
was
that's what I'm saying. I'm thinking that there's something to it where God, the life force, because it took over this male type of leadership role, took over for a reason. There's an occurrence. So that's what I'm saying, is that it's I don't. That's not an innocent type of thing that we're chopping off our. And I don't have issue with anybody doing whatever they're doing today, or even back then. But I'm just saying, from that point of view, from why it would have occurred, you know, uh, that is something that obviously triggered other events to occur, to then where we had to go down the path
I mean,
that we went
I think
down.
in the simplest terms, I think the macho men took power because they could. Um, and that the Bronze Age and the Iron Age was pretty much like one marauding empire after another, and the fast track to wealth was to steal it. It was to defeat your neighbors,
Yeah,
take
I
all the
agree
wealth,
with that.
and
Yeah,
keep it for
because
yourself, and force them into
yeah.
slavery.
Yeah, that's
And
what the Freemasons have done, and not just them, but other civilizations. They take over a place, because they're warring. They conquer whoever, and then they just claim all these buildings as their own, and it's
yeah,
not
so
none of their own.
one war king comes along and rolls over and
Right,
takes over, and then they rule for a while, a couple generations maybe, and then some other warrior from another tribe comes through, rolls over to them, and steals all their stuff, and then a couple generations later, somebody else does it again. It's just these cycles of violence and these cycles
right,
of marauding. I mean, it's just theft, and they've been doing it.
right.
And this was what male power has been built on ever since. And um, things in the 21st century, things have changed. Like the internet and technology and stuff is fundamentally changing the world we live in and the nature of society. Um, and I think in terms of what's happening today is our old religions are failing us, and
Hmm.
we're entering into a very dangerous time period where the traditional religions, Christianity and Islam and the rest, are really being challenged. People are leaving in droves, and but nothing new has arisen to replace it. And so you end up in a very chaotic social space. It's like I mean, the Reformation between Catholics and Protestants was bloody for 200 years. I mean, really, really bloody. And I think that that's what we're entering into now is a Reformation type period. I think the 21st century is going to be driven as wars of religion across the board. Um, whether it's the Israeli Zionists, the Islamic Jihad, Hindu nationalism, Christian nationalism, and the MAGA, or I mean, and the woke on the left. Like the woke is its own. This is what I'm saying, that like
Yeah, the
everything on the
science
left
religion.
is they don't realize it yet, but it's all goddess religion across the board. Everything that the left is doing, they don't realize that they're fighting a war of religion, but they are.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
and
agree with all that, and I don't want to put the idea out there that I'm for patriarchy or male dominance or anything. That's not what I was saying. I'm just trying to think along the lines of why
well, I think
that type of
I
thing
think Yahweh in
would
the Old
occur.
Testament is genuinely they're really a social reformer. They're really the prophets really are concerned with social justice, which was not really necessarily high on the high on the concern list for the Canaanite leaders.
Right.
They really are concerned with social justice. They really, whether you agree with them or not, they see these sex rituals as something that needs to be stopped. We don't do them anymore. I don't think people would want to have public sex rituals now. So I think we can agree with that. I think we'd all agree with ending child sacrifice. Like that was, people debate whether it happened. I have personally, I've researched it quite a bit. I'm 100% convinced that it was totally real, and that it was a
Oh
real
yeah, it's
tradition,
still real. Yeah.
and that the followers of Yahweh were quite genuine in wanting to stop doing that, and so did the Greeks. The Greeks didn't like it either. And then same with idolatry. Like these were old, outdated superstitions that their time had come and gone. But now we're at a period where Christianity is it's like Judaism is an Iron Age religion. Christianity is not much newer. I mean, and I don't think that they are keeping up with the space age myself.
Yeah, I think Christianity has held a lot of people back. Say, I'm not a Christian myself. I'm a knower of Jesus and follower and lover of Jesus. I've communicated with Jesus very often, and his message has been distorted and perverted by the Christian. I don't come from a Christian background. I only went to Sunday school from like the ages of 5 to 10. Sometimes. I didn't go very often. I knew nothing of Jesus. But then through my psychic abilities, through my psychedelic trips, through my meditations, I have come to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and I have demons. I have had demons released from my body and out of my root chakra. I do Kundalini work, or not Kundalini work, but I help cut the heads off of Kundalini energy. Everybody has a Kundalini snake, and I cut the serpents off of people's head, or off of the head of the serpent using the eagle talons. It's a very strange thing that just happened to me one day, and then I've been doing it ever since. But it's through the use of Jesus Christ. Now, his message is very different than what Christianity is, and a lot of Christians don't like me for the way that I talk about Christianity, but because I'm a follower of Jesus, they want to keep me in the box of Christianity. But that's just not what the deal is. But see, what I see happening, or is what's going to happen after the war. There is, as you were saying, the Reformation. I agree that there's going to be something. I don't know what, but there's going to be some kind of event that occurs. But then once we get through the rubble, once that's all done, that there's going to be a coming together like maybe never before, and that the masculine and the feminine are both going to be equally doing things to make this a peaceful, loving place that maybe has never existed. From the research that I'm gathering from you, this has been going on for a very long time, and that maybe that this is going to be such a new, different time in history. Maybe, I don't know,
I think
but
anything's
I hope so.
possible in the space in the cyber age. It could be total totalitarianism, or it could be, um, New Eden, or something in between. Um, I think, but we are in a time now where it's important to forge new communities that are intentional about creating a better world, because
Right.
we live in a chaotic world right now, and if we don't actively create something better, then we're not going to end up with something better. We're going to end up with
Yeah.
something worse. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say about the cannabis in the Bible. So you said that it was misspelled, or
No, it's canna bosom, or canna, QANEH is the main, and then sometimes it's canna bosom, which is BOSM, which just means like sweet or aromatic. But the canna is it's the same root. QAN is the same root for reed, or for branch, or for hemp. Um, and so the canna is hemp. And then the five references are: the first one is that I mentioned the ingredient in most holy anointing oil, and it gets mistranslated as a plant called calamus. Now, some people will say it's not mistranslated; that it really is calamus. Calamus is called it's like a marsh plant, and I guess it exists in the Middle East, but and it is used in perfumes. It does have like some usage. It has some use in Ayurvedic medicine, but it's not like a sacred plant with like a deep tradition and sacred in usage or anything. But some people say it really is calamus in that ingredient. But the other references are much more ambiguous. And sometimes they translate as calamus, sometimes they translate it as aromatic cane. So depending on which translation you're looking at, aromatic cane doesn't really mean anything, but it sure could, you could see a tall stand of hemp as being aromatic cane, because that's some smelly stuff. And so
right,
um, you can see how cannabis fits that translation. The second verse is in Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, where, which is the one beautiful, romantic, sensual part book in the Bible. And he's comparing his beautiful bride to all these aromatic herbs and frankly drug plants. Um, and there's a list of plants, and cannabis is one in this sort of in a list of beautiful plants he's comparing his bride to in the garden. Then the other three references are in various prophets. Um, and it's listed twice as something that's being burned in the temple, and then once as a trade good out of Tyre, which is Lebanon, which is they've been growing cannabis in Lebanon since the Neolithic and till to today. Like, they get some of the best marijuana is grown in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon to this day. Um, and they were growing it there in biblical times and in Roman times and way back, because those are some of the oldest Neolithic settlements. And in Baalbek, which is a town named for Baal, um, has one of the most remarkable temple sites in the whole of the ancient world, at Baalbek. And it is uh, well, oh yeah, no. So it's the home of these three stones called the Trilithon. If you're not familiar with the Trilithon, you should look it up in Baalbek. They're the three biggest stones that have ever been cut and moved by human beings in the history of the world. Like the three biggest, like bricks, basically. They're as big as a city bus each. They're like 900 tons a piece, and they were cut out of a quarry about a mile away, dragged uphill, and then elevated about 30 feet in the air. They're on the third course of stones. They're not on the bottom, on top of also another row of like massive rocks, massive stones. And then, so this was the most important temple site to the Phoenicians and the Canaanites. It's a really, really important and remarkable site. And then when the Romans came along later, they rebuilt it and they changed the name to Heliopolis, and they rebuilt the temples to Jupiter, Venus, and Bacchus, so Dionysus. Um, and the temple to Jupiter they built there is this one that has the trilithon stones in it. Like that's in the foundation in the platform. The Romans built it as the single largest temple anywhere in the Roman Empire, bigger than any of the temples in Rome, bigger than this is the single largest temple they built anywhere with the tallest columns and really, really magnificent temple. And it's still, you can go visit it today. A lot of it is still intact.
And it's funny
Um,
the way that it looks because right above those large stones that you're talking about, they're tiny, and it looks
right,
you
right.
can tell it's very different. And the Romans just, as we were saying earlier, came along and claimed it as their own, but it really
Right. Yeah. The
wasn't.
Romans didn't do the trilithon stones. They never claimed it. They didn't document it. And in
Okay.
fact, and it's on like the backside. When the Romans rebuilt the temple, they kind of hid those stones. Like they're on the backside. They're not like up front where you would see them. If it was their own work, they would have made a big deal of it, but it wasn't their work. It was already existing. And so nobody knows who put the trilithon stones there. They're totally undated. They're a total mystery. It's pretty cool. Like nobody can say who put them there or how, frankly, because they're so freaking big.
Well, they were
It,
probably giants that put Jupiter, Uranus, and
well,
someone else probably put
that's
them
what the
there.
legends say, that they were built by giants at the time of the floods.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that the giants probably died off only about 200 years ago. The oxygen got to be such a low point that they died off in the 1800s. And I don't know if you're familiar with Tartaria, but that's where all this Tartaria stuff is now coming out.
I don't know about that, but I do know, or I have a theory anyway, about life in the ice age that, perhaps there were a lot of other human beings around more than we realize, different types like
Right.
Cro-Magnon. And maybe there were giants, like tall people, like literally like big, different types of people that didn't survive the Younger Dryas.
Yeah, like the
Um,
elven people, the ogres, all that type of stuff.
yeah, so maybe there were, so maybe some of these stories about Nephilim and giants are memories of, it's totally speculation, but just memories of like different types of creatures that existed back.
Well, I think that what that is they're an amalgamation of human DNA and something else. Like that's what all aliens are. Some kind of, you got the cryptoids, you got your insectoids, you got your fairies. They're insect plus human DNA together, and they come out all these. Some will come out looking like grasshoppers. Some will come out tiny with wings. All these different types of things, but it's all the fallen angels are the ones who were taking DNA from humans and from the reptiles, the birds, the animals, combining them and making all these other creatures.
So do you think there's actual entities that are
Oh
messing
yeah.
with us?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That and they would look like the grays nowadays because they're so old and they can't hide or they can't go in the sun that they would eventually, that's what we would look like if we went without the sun for a long and we lived for a very long time. They can't go into the sun because it would burn them, so that they need the human, a dead human body in order to put their soul or their consciousness, do a transfer of consciousness. And that's where you get the reptilian look to them, is that if you take dirt or you could take mud and then you dry it out, eventually it's going to start to have cracks on it. It's going to have lines, very even looking lines. It's once it gets dried out to the point, and that's why they're so dried out that they look like they're reptiles.
All right. Well, I don't know. I'm open-minded on aliens, but I don't have an opinion about the Greys or any specific creatures. Um, but I'm open-minded to finding out what we find out. I've known people that were 100% insistent that they'd been picked up by the
Oh,
Greys.
I have. Yeah, yeah, I have. I experienced the abduction phenomenon my whole young life, as a child and as a teenager. I was very terrified of my backyard, of my windows. I have all these very vivid dreams, and then I wake up with different marks on my body. And the only thing that ever stopped it was once I got the relationship with Jesus in the last like 6 months. That's the only thing that's ever stopped it. I was experiencing these things my entire life, and it was awful. And a lot of people say, "Oh, well, some people have good experience saying, oh, they're upgrading us, But to me, that ain't. It's not cool at all. So, that's another topic for another show. But these types of things, the more that I study the Book of Enoch, the more that I realize that all these types of things can be explained by the fallen angels and the activities that they were doing that's described in the Book of Enoch and the Bible, that these are the things that they were doing. They were mixing human DNA with other things that live here, and then all these different creations came about. It's, to me, that makes more sense than anything else in all the information that I've received psychically, all the research that I've done, all the just all my life experience has provided to me, is that that's kind of what happens, and that these androgynous beings that were being worshipped were probably the fallen angels, because angels are supposed to be sexless, or not supposed to be one specific sex, and that they would be androgynous. They would have both a penis and a vagina because they are both. So, uh, what you're saying to me today just kind of is reconfirming or strengthening my position on all of that.
Well, there are definitely stories about the sexless eunuchs or trans or sexless creatures. One of the best ones is so Inanna from Sumer is the same goddess as Ishtar and Astarte from the Bible, and many of her stories have her challenging the other gods for like their role or for their authority. And so one of the most famous stories is her journey to the underworld, where she challenges her sister. Her sister Ereshkigal is the queen of the underworld, like Hades. Um, but Ishtar, for whatever reason, she wants more power and glory for herself. So she goes down to the underworld to challenge her sister. She's got to go through these 7 gates, and at every gate she has to remove some of her sacred clothing. She's got a crown, all this jewelry. So when she gets to the 7th gate, she's naked. She's been stripped naked, and she's furious. And this is all very symbolic. 7 gates is there's all sorts of symbolism about that. But anyway, so when she gets through, Ereshkigal knows what's up. She's not fooled by her sister. So Ereshkigal has her killed, has Inanna killed. Now Inanna has already laid plans for this, so that her faithful vizier Ninshibur has to go and plead Inanna's case, the other gods, most of whom ignore her, but not Enki, who is like the god of wisdom and cleverness and water. He creates these transgendered, sexless creatures to go down to the underworld and rescue Inanna.
So was Enki like her brother, or
Quasi father. He's older.
okay?
So there's the 4 creator gods, An and Ki. Ki is Ninhursag. That's the mother goddess. That's like Asherah. An is El. Enki is like the god of water and wisdom. And then Enlil was the original king of the gods. And then you've got 3 more gods that are the sun, moon, and Venus. Venus being Inanna, the sun and moon. The sun is her brother Shamhash, I think. Those are the 7 gods that decree the fates. The 7 that decree the fates. They were the most important gods in Sumer.
Okay.
So Inanna, so Enki sends down these sexless eunuchs to rescue her, and they bring the food of life and the water of life. And when they go down there, they find that Ereshkigal, like keeled over in agony as though she's giving birth, even though she's not pregnant. And so so she's like begging for relief. So that these eunuchs or whoever they are, they sprinkle the food of life and the water of life on Inanna so that she can come back to life. And then she's allowed to leave, but she must return a substitute. She has to send somebody down to substitute for her. And so Ereshkigal sends these demons to follow Inanna back to the surface. And so Inanna's got to go down looking for someone that she can send back to the underworld, someone to kill, basically. but she doesn't want to do it to Ninshubur because that's her faithful vizier, and a couple other gods that as soon as Inanna shows up, they show that they've been mourning and that they're, dutifully respectful of Inanna, so she doesn't choose them. But when she gets home, she finds her husband Dumuzi, who is also a very important character, the first of the Shepherd Kings, also called Tammuz. Um, she finds that he's celebrating. He's sitting in her throne. He's got some slave girls dancing for him. He's dressed in his finest clothes. He's having a good old time with Inanna out of the way. Now he's risen. And so Inanna finds him there and she's furious. She says, "How dare you? You're supposed to be mourning me. You should be wearing sackcloth and ashes and be weeping and banging a drum. And because I've just been dead for a couple of days, you're not supposed to be having a party." Um, so she says, "All right, you can have him. You can have my husband." And so the demons set upon poor, terrified Dumuzi, who his story actually goes on. He flees for his life and he begs for help, and it's actually a long story. But eventually, the demons catch up to him, and he's brought down to the underworld. But then Inanna, she regrets her actions later on, and she's weeping, and so then they Dumuzi's sister comes along, and they make a decision that his sister will substitute for Dumuzi half the year, so Dumuzi can come back up, and his sister will replace him, and that becomes this is a mirror of in the Greeks. This is the mirror of Demeter and Persephone, and this is the dying rising god myth. This is the oldest one we've got, where all the pagan cultures had a dying and rising god that represented the turning of the seasons and the cycle of life, fertility, and all this stuff. And so in the Sumerians, it's Dumuzi, who's the original dying and rising god, and he gets sent down there by his wife, and this is part of Ishtar's. So then the stories get retold with Ishtar and Tammuz, and that's in the Bible. Ezekiel talks about the women weeping for Tammuz. That's this story, and one of the months on the Hebrew calendar is Tammuz. So we know that this is the Hebrew culture. This is the Canaanite Israelite culture, that they have these traditions. Dumuzi is the first shepherd king, and he was possibly a real person. He was like Gilgamesh, listed on the king's list of Uruk. Uruk was the first great city in the world in Sumer, in ancient Sumer, before Babylon came along. And so, yeah, so this story of this is the original dying and rising god, or at least the oldest one we've got, because it's the oldest written, just because it comes from the oldest writing that we've got. But all the cultures had one. And then the Christians recycle it with Jesus, except they make it not about nature and not about the turning of the seasons, even though it's still a springtime resurrection festival. These are all holidays, these would all be like big, important festivals. And so they had all these pagan cultures had a New Year's, springtime. Spring was the New Year's,
Right.
because it's like the turning of the seasons and stuff. And so they would celebrate this dying, rising god and his turning of the seasons. And Dumuzi was the oldest one. And the thing about that story is that the oldest one has the goddess being the most like dominant, and like Ishtar goes to like take over the underworld. She's not satisfied with all the power she already has. She's already a high goddess, but she wants more power. And then her husband falls victim to her ambition, and she kills him. This is not the kind of
So
thing that.
after he returns, oh no, this is
Oh no,
Anana's. Okay,
yeah, this is
mom.
Inanna and Ishtar are the same goddess, so you can change the
Oh,
name.
okay.
It's the same thing.
So
Um,
What's his name? Damuz or
Dumuzi,
Tamu?
yeah. And
Damuzi. Okay.
well, it's Dumuzi is the older one, is Sumerian. And then in
Okay.
Babylon and in the Bible, they call him Tammuz, Tammuz, but it's the
Okay.
same god. And so this was a really, really important tradition. It lasts for thousands of years. And this is one of the things that they get rid of when the Yahwists come along, the Jews come along. This is exactly the stuff that they're eliminating. They don't like these traditions.
Well, it's
They want
very
to.
fitting that today's the last day of summer and tomorrow is the fall equinox.
All
Is
right,
it-
hey, here we go.
Yeah. So this is when the female goes down, I guess, and switches places with Tammuz.
Well, it's always like it's generally the Greeks have it to be a female, but usually it's a male god that goes down and dies.
Okay. So the male is switching
And
out
then
now.
and then
Okay.
and then the key thing is that it's a goddess who restores them. The goddess is the one who brings them back, and that's why
Okay,
the
that makes
goddesses are
sense.
so sent. These are goddess traditions. The goddess is the one at the heart of the story. She's the central element. Um, and all the cultures had them.
Right, and she
There's
has
a
the
ton of diagrams.
rebirth on in spring, the Passover, the passing over of the sun, or the day now being longer than the night, the passing over of the sun over the equator. Yeah, there's so much symbolism in that. So that is an incredible tale that I've never heard before. You seem very studied in the ancient Sumer, and
Sumer I really like because it's the oldest stories. It's our very first writing. It's from the invention of writing, and so they're really unique stories because they're the ones that allow us to peer farthest back in history,
so,
and you see shifts from the
right.
very oldest stories. There's a flood story like the same as the Noah's flood um,
Right.
in Sumer, and so as you examine the commonalities but also the distinctions, you can see how things are changing. And what you really see is the goddesses losing rank and status over time.
So, the cuneiforms, or well, before I get into that, what do you know about what year they were saying that the flood was in the Sumer?
They don't put a date on it.
Oh, okay. So, are you familiar with the cuneiform tablets? How many of these tablets have you been able to look into at all, if any?
I mean, I'm not a scholar of cuneiform. I don't read cuneiform. I just, read the translations by
Right, right. I just meant, all the translations. How many are you familiar with the
well,
tablets?
I mean, they used it for 2,000 years. I mean, cuneiform is how they did writing
Right,
for
right.
the entire Near East. Like Egyptian hieroglyphics doesn't go outside of Egypt, but cuneiform gets exported, and so they use it all across the Near East. And that's actually why it's also another reason why the Sumerians are important because they really export a lot of their culture along with exporting writing.
Okay.
So which is part of the reason why you see these same stories recycled over and over again with just little details changing. Um,
Well, it sounds to me like this is kind of the real story of the Anunnaki. That
the Anunnaki are part of that story. They're actually explicitly they actually I didn't even mention them, but when Ishtar or Inanna goes down and is standing in front of Resh Kigal, it's the Anunnaki who judge Inanna and judge her to die. That's a detail I mentioned.
so
I should mention.
they were in down in the underworld in the seventh chakra and the root
They're in the
chakra.
underworld. In that story, they're not really described who they are. It's not clear what their identity is, but they're specifically mentioned. The Anunnaki judge Inanna and judge her to die.
Oh wow, this is this is just so much
Yeah, it's called
together.
it's Inanna's Descent to the Underworld. You can read about it. It's you can Google it.
Yeah, I will definitely get on that because, what you're bringing me here today is just putting together so many different pieces that I didn't even know that, you don't know what you don't know. And I didn't know that I needed this information as as badly as I did. And I'm so glad that we got to connect and that you have been able to bring all of this to my audience as well as myself and enlighten us in so many different ways. This is information where you're just going off of, from the Romans to the Greeks to the Egyptians to all of these different ancient civilizations, and it's very amazing how you're able to put this all together.
Well, thanks. Like I said, I was just stitching threads together, um, just finding the common thread and just putting it together and recognizing where they connect. It's all I've been trying to do. I don't do the original scholarship. I read the scholars, and then just I'm looking for these common threads. Um,
So, how many years have you been doing this?
um, well, I started this project and I worked on it. In terms of writing this book, I started it in late 2018, and then I committed as of January 1, 2018. No, 2019. January 1, 2019. I committed to working on the book full time, and didn't have a job. So I was in California at the time. I spent 6, 7 months working on writing the first draft of the manuscript. And then I spent the rest of the year coming cross country and moving back east to the East Coast. And then I got a full-time job in 2020, and then the pandemic kicked in, and I spent 2020 working on the second draft. Like, well, it was like the fourth draft really, but like revising the book for where we got it published. So that was all of 2020 that I was working on it on the side, while I had a full-time job, and then published it early of 2021. It came out like in the spring of this year.
Okay.
And so then since then, I've actually been continuing, like the research in the book was like, I was writing it as I was learning it. And the book started out as a history of cannabis and turned into this history of the goddess. So there's a lot of like extra cannabis material in there that I probably would have put in if I'd started it as a history of the goddess originally. And so the book, there's still more I could have done with the book. And I kept doing research since the book has been done. And my sort of theory has continued to evolve. But the book was like what I had done at the time that my deadline came, and like, all right, I had to put that. I was still writing it the day I like turned it into my publisher.
Yeah, it's a never-ending journey, and perfection is the enemy of good because you can always change it a little bit. You
Yeah,
can always
so
get more information.
I would love to do another book that's a little more concise, a little more reader friendly. But yeah, I was working on that basically for 2 years, and now it's like, we're third year into it. But this history of cannabis, I'd been studying for over 20 years because that
Mm.
was a hobby of mine going back to when I was in college. And there's sort of a long story there. And so this notion of studying this common thread of history that goes back to the Neolithic is something that I'd already been practicing for a really, really long time. So I'd sort of, when I realized that cannabis was sacred to the goddesses, and that everywhere where the cannabis is thickest is where you find the strongest goddess cultures, I just started following the stuff I already knew. And it kept leading me back to like, so to the point, like India in Hinduism has the strongest today, where you can find the goddesses and the most clearly represented and the most vibrant traditions that are explicitly about goddesses, the Devi and Shakti and all this. Um, well, and they have tons of cannabis. They have tons of weed, and the Hindus have always thought cannabis was sacred. Um, they had religious exemptions all through the 20th century during the height of the drug war. Even in India, they still had religious exemptions for cannabis. The Scythians are a really important tribe. They were the nomadic horse lords and sort of these barbarians, so to speak, during the Greek and Roman era. Well, by the Romans, they're sort of faded out, but they were definitely fought against the Greeks, and then they predated, they go way back. So they were the nomadic horse riding people from the Asian steppe, from
What was their name?
the Scythians,
Scythians.
Scythians,
So like
and they
scythe.
were the Amazon warriors because they're an egalitarian culture that followed the goddesses and had a warrior queen they had queens for leaders, and they fought against the Greeks. And on horseback, a woman with a bow and arrow is just as deadly as a man. And so in these nomadic cultures, they taught the girls to ride and fight and hunt alongside the boys. And so
Mm.
when they get to adulthood or adolescence, the women were given a choice whether they wanted to do the child rearing and hang out in the back with the supplies, or do they want to continue on as warrior women, as adult warrior women. And so, like, judging from the number of graves that they found, because they found hundreds and hundreds of graves, it's all really well documented. Like 20% of 20 or 30% of the graves are warrior women, and put it that way. So it's like a substantial part of their culture of women that rode into battle alongside the men. And they fought
Wow.
against the Greeks, and the Greeks, who were super patriarchal and kept their women totally locked down, were just utterly blown away by, just culturally shocked by going into battle and losing against women. And
Mm.
so this was a really, really important in Greek mythology. The Hercules and a lot of Greek heroes have to go fight Amazon warrior queens.
Is this
Um,
where the legend of the Amazon women, the very tall women, this is where they come from?
this is where they come from. And they were totally a cannabis using culture. Cannabis comes from Central Asia. Horses love cannabis. They use the ropes for like reins to catch horses in the first place. Um,
Wow.
and they were documented by Herodotus 500 BC for getting high. It's the oldest reference we have of like talking about people explicitly throwing cannabis on a fire and getting high from it are the Scythians. Um,
Wow. Wow, this is you're a wealth of knowledge. This is amazing. So I want to get wrapped up here in a few minutes, but I saw on your website and you talked about a little bit earlier that
oh
you're
yeah, so I'd
looking
like
for
to
help
yeah, so I'd
on
like to
some
plug
projects.
my website, my project. So my current project now is to turn all this stuff into like graphic novels and like have these stories told. Um, like you said, I got a lot of content here. I got a lot of material. And so I want to turn these things into graphic novels. I'd like to find some funding. I'd like to find an investor. I've had an awesome response from artists but I don't have the budget to like start hiring every artist I talk to. Um, so we're doing some stuff online. I've got some art coming that will be minting as NFTs and selling in the crypto art space. But really what I want to do is graphic novels. So I got this website, lostgoddess.io. If anyone's listening, check it out. I've got that's my new website, and that's where I sort of I list in terms of the characters, try to like describe these characters and get people excited about who these characters really are, because I think people need to get to know Ishtar. She really could really be a powerful icon for the modern day feminist. Um, she's really her stories are just really remarkable. She's a remarkable character. And then we didn't even talk about Anat, who's the most terrifying one of all. Um,
Good, you
but
can go into her a little bit if you want.
So she comes from the Ugaritic text, and she was Baal's consort. Um,
Mm.
and she's not mentioned in the Bible. I call her she who must not be named. So they mention Asherah like 40 times. Astarte gets mentioned about a dozen times, but with various titles. Um, she's called Ashtoreth, which means shameful Astarte. They call her the Queen of Heaven. Uh, they call her a bunch of different things, but it adds up to about a dozen references to Astarte. But Anat and then Baal is referenced, I don't know how many times, loads of times. Um, Anat was totally there, but they don't mention her because she is so. Do you know who Kali is of the Hindus?
Yeah,
She's like
yeah, the call, yeah,
Kali Ma. She's the goddess of destruction, and she's got a skull necklace and a belt of human hands, and she's covered in blood. That's Anat. Anat is like that too. She's also covered in blood, wearing a skull necklace. She's a goddess of death and slaughter. She's Astarte's best friend. They ride into battle together. But Astarte is the goddess of like strategy, and like she leads the kings to victory through strategy and tactics. But Anat is the goddess of slaughter.
Is
She goes to
she
where
Lilith?
I don't know. Lilith is
Okay,
a whole nother discussion. I don't talk about Lilith in my
okay,
book, and because she's not in the Bible. So I don't know. I don't talk about Lilith. Uh,
okay.
um,
Sorry, I
but
didn't mean to throw you off track.
but Anat is like basically what would be considered a demonic force in later Christian terms, for
Like the
sure.
Queen of the
She is
Damned or something.
she is quite terrifying. In the Ugaritic texts I was mentioning that are the prequels to the Bible, she goes and visits El, and they wanted to get a temple built for Baal because Baal has now been installed as king of the gods, and Baal needs a temple. So when Anat goes to visit her father El, the creator of the universe, God, she threatens to smash his skull in, and she says, "I'll throw you down if you don't give me what I want. I'll throw you down like a lamb. I'll smash your skull in. I'll make your gray beard run red with blood and gore." Um, in other parts of the story, she's slaughtering humans and just wallowing in a pile of corpses and laughing, her belly filled with victory.
Did
She's
Elle
waving.
give in to her?
It, Elle does give her what she wants. Elle consents to her request, and she says, "You are very wise. Thank you very much." Elle never disputes what she says. He says, "Oh, nobody's more violent and terrible than you, my daughter." But he sort of
Mm,
laughs it off like his teenage daughter's tantrum.
mm,
But he doesn't dispute her, and he doesn't get mad at her.
mm.
Um, and then there's another part of the story where so there's three gods, Baal, Yam, and Mot, and they're just like Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. So Baal is fighting with Yam, his brother Yam, who's like the same as Poseidon. They're fighting to be king of the gods, and eventually Baal wins. And then Baal, when he becomes king, similar to Inanna, he tries to take out Mot, and he wants to defeat Mot. But the gods say, no, you can't defeat Mot. And so Mot kills Baal. And so Baal dies. And this is a big dramatic part of the story. And El is upset, and El comes down and he's mourning and wearing sackcloth. And Anat is upset and she's mourning and wearing sackcloth, and she buries her beloved Baal. And Anat is so upset that she goes and finds Mot, who, remind you, is like, he's like Hades. He's a very powerful god, right? She
Hmm.
finds Mot. She goes up to him. She grabs him by the collar and screams, "Give me back my brother!" And then she pulls out a sword and cuts him in half, grinds him up with a sieve, burns him, and feeds him to the birds. And with doing that, Baal is restored to life and majesty, and he sits upon the throne, and Baal becomes king of the gods. And that's the Canaanite dying and rising god myth, is about Baal being dying and restoring. And it's Anat who restores him. She restores him by cutting the god of death in half with a sword. Like there is no,
Wow.
yeah, right. There's nobody like that anywhere in mythology. There's no Greek character like that in Greek mythology. This would be, by Greek terms, this would be a goddess who, first of all, she's covered in blood. Who is Baal, who's Zeus's great love, Zeus's greatest defender. Zeus, she helps Zeus defeat Poseidon and basically defeats Poseidon herself. And then Zeus dies, so she goes and finds Hades, cuts him in half with a sword, and feeds him to the birds. And she puts Zeus on the throne. Can you imagine that? No. There's nothing like that in Greek mythology. There is no character that is more powerful than Zeus. There's no goddess more powerful than Zeus. But these goddesses of the Bronze Age are like that. They are more powerful than the male gods. And Anat is the most powerful one of all because she's the only one who can go up to El and threaten him. She's the only one who can destroy death. I mean, she's the most powerful goddess of all. And she just loves it. She just like delights in slaughter. She has fun going out on the battlefield and just carving people to pieces. I mean, it's really bloody, gnarly stuff, man. It's
Mm.
gnarly.
Wow. This has been wow. And one last thing, it's right on. As soon as you go on your website, it says that Asherah, she was exiled. She was divorced from God and then exiled.
Right.
Uh, so can you go over that for
Oh
a
yeah. So the
second?
divorce is in the Bible. So basically the entire, so you get the first temple and then the Babylon exile and then the second temple, right? The first temple is all pagan. Yahweh is a pagan god. El and Yahweh are two separate gods during this entire period. This is not what the biblical writers say. This is what I've kind of figured out. This is my version of events. El and Yahweh are two separate gods. Yahweh is competing with Baal. He's competing with the other gods. And this goes on the entire first temple period. The Kadesha and the Kadesh are in the temple. The Asherah pole stands in Solomon's temple for 2/3 of its history. It's pagan through and through. The northern kingdom of Israel is pagan all the way. Um, and the reformer kings are unpopular. So they have brief periods of reform where they impose Yahweh's rules, but they don't last past the length of that particular king. And so then eventually it all gets destroyed by the Babylonians and Jerusalem is wiped out and the first temple is destroyed to pieces. And they go to Babylon in the exile. For that entire period, they've been worshiping these goddesses. And Jeremiah, who's one of the prophets who witnesses the exile, who witnesses the fall of Jerusalem and goes with the exiles, he blames the women for their worship of the Queen of Heaven. So it was your fault that this all happened. And they say, "Fuck you, Jeremiah." It's in Jeremiah 44. You can look it up. The women totally yell back at Jeremiah and say, "No, everything was great when we worshiped the Queen of Heaven. It's not our fault." They're like, "Fuck you." And Jeremiah's like, "Well, whatever." And he leaves. And so they'd been worshiping the Queen of Heaven, Ishtar, Astarte, the entire time. But when they go, so then they go to Babylon exile, and it's like 150 years before they come back. Well, it's about 75 years before Cyrus comes in and frees them. He defeats the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great is leader of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire defeats the Babylonian Empire. Persians become the new dominant power, and the Persians are friendly to the Hebrews. And so the Persians start sponsoring the Hebrew prophets that are living in Babylon, and they write the Torah. That's when the Bible gets written. The Old Testament gets written in Babylon, and it gets brought back by Ezra. Ezra is a biblical character. The Bible's not real explicit about it, and so scholars dispute, precisely what was brought back at which time. But the Bible does say that Ezra brought the book, what they call the Book of the Law, back to Jerusalem from Babylon, and at that time they read it out loud. It's presumably the Torah. It's presumably the core parts of the Old Testament, although they definitely kept working on it. And then Ezra is upset when he finds out. So after he does that, Ezra is horrified when he finds out that the Jewish men have been marrying and having families with local Canaanite women. And Ezra says, no, you cannot do this. You can only marry Jewish women. These local women are, now he doesn't say this, but they are worshiping the goddesses still, and they're pagans, and they've got maternal bloodlines, and they are unacceptable to be married. You cannot marry these women because they're going to lead you astray. And so he forces all, this is in the Bible, forces all the men to divorce the Canaanite women and abandon their families. Um, and so that's what they do. And so that is the divorce. That's the final act in the divorce. And after that, now you're into the second temple. There's no cannabis. There's no holy smoke. There's no goddesses. There's no Kadesha. All the pagan stuff is gone in the second temple. But the first temple was totally pagan.
Wow. Wow. Man, I gotta tell the audience, hey, if you guys are looking to, join up with somebody, what Ed has brought here today is just completely mind blowing, and it's a very concise story. Not that it's a story, but and the way that you're presenting it all, and there's so much in there, and I'm sure we could break down each, you know, Greek gods, Roman
Oh
gods.
yeah, we could go on for hours. I would love to find some scholars and really put my work to the test because I would. It's pretty radical stuff, and I'd like to get into it with some scholars on this stuff because I'm pretty confident in my theory here and in my presentation. Um,
Where can everybody reach you at?
lostgoddess.io, there's a contact
Okay.
form, or on my old website. There's historyofgoddess.com also. I've got two websites out there, but Lost Goddess is the new one. That's the one I'm really focusing on. And
Okay.
I'm on Twitter, lostgoddess.io, also on Twitter. I've got a couple Twitter accounts. It's all, there's a link tree. But yeah, lostgoddess.io has you can contact for me, reach out to me there.
Okay. And I will have the links in the description. Um, is there anything that you want to leave the audience with? Is there any final parting words that you have?
I don't know. This has been great. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your encouragement on the whole thing. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah, I think that I think we need to tell new stories. I think we need to relearn these old stories and start telling some new stories, and that mythology matters, and that these stories matter for a reason, and that we got to adapt them to the new age because we're living in some pretty wild times. So buckle up, buckle up, folks.
One last question I like to ask all my guests is, what is your grounding technique? You're doing a lot of research. You're doing a lot of different things. You're going full force in this. So, what do you like to do to ground yourself to really, you know, pull yourself back from all your research? And then, what do you like to do to relax when you're trying to, let go of all the stress of day-to-day stuff?
I take a walk in the afternoon. I used to have a dog, but she died. So I'd
Oh.
gotten in the habit of taking walks at the end of my work day, at the end of my writing day with my dog. But and then the dog died this past Christmas. That was sad. She was old. She was a good dog. Um, and I just kept taking walks in the afternoon. I don't know, smoke some pot, hang out, pretty chill. I'm a pretty low key guy.
All
Well, how
right.
about you?
Well,
How do you
so I meditate every morning, and then throughout the day, I'll when I start to get stressed, I'll close my eyes and just do a few deep breaths. Breathe in through the nose, swallow the breath, hold it for a few seconds, and then let go of all of the worries and stress that I have. And for relaxation, see, nobody's ever asked me this. You're about like my 50th guest, and nobody's ever asked me. So for relaxation, I like to. Depends on the time of year. I like to do a lot of stuff outside. I like to do fires. I like to do stuff with my girlfriend. Sometimes like right now, we've been watching the series Lucifer on Netflix. We're almost done that. So, and TV is not something that we even watch. Like we might get an episode here or there. So it's not something that we go to. But I like to do stuff with my daughter, play basketball with her, and exercise. There's so many different things that I like to do to ground myself. But for relaxation, I like doing this podcast actually. For doing stuff with the podcast, editing, all the audio. That is actually relaxing for me. I spend like 3 hours doing something in a day, and it just breezes by.
Well, I would love to do a, a more professional podcast, or not that this isn't professional, but of my own, because I'm a writer, and so I find doing all the video editing just to be a complete pain in my ass. And
Yeah, video is tough. I do the editing for audio because video is a whole nother thing that it takes up so much more time, and I don't have enough time in my day right now to watch a whole, to find out the different sections. There's a lot to it. Audio is much easier.
right.
All right, so I guess that is going to be everything. I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was an excellent, enlightening conversation, and I look forward to having you on again and breaking
Yeah,
down
thanks, Todd.
something.
Yeah, I'll come back on, and I appreciate the invite, and yeah, I hope people enjoyed it.
All right, so we're going to say goodbye to our audience. Goodbye, everybody. We will talk to you later.
Bye.